It can be very broad or quite narrow. Maybe you want to make inference about the whole adult population of your country. And so it is important to carefully define your target population according to the purpose and practicalities of your research or your project. As for sampling frame, the sampling frame is the actual list of individuals that the sample will be drawn from. Ideally, it should include the entire target population and nobody who is not part of the population. Next is we have the sample size. The sample size is the number of individuals you should include in your samples. Depends on various factors, including the size and variability of the population and your research design. There are different sample size calculators and formulas and depending you want to achieve with statistical analysis. So moving on to probability sampling methods. So I have a PowerPoint presentation for this. It's not the best because I didn't put any designs on it, but it should have the necessary information that you will need for the exam. So most of the information I got is from Scribber, the site that I just presented earlier, and from Genio. Though most of the what do you call this? The information that I got was from Scribber, but I also included some of the informations in Genio because some of the informations in Genio are not in Scribber. So I suggest to check both of them to properly know them more. So moving on to probability sampling method. So okay, so probability sampling method or probability sampling means that every member of the population has a chance of being selected. Probability sampling techniques are the most valid choice. So there are four main types of probability sampling over here in this image. There is the simple random sample, the systematic sample, and the stratified sample and cluster sample. Moving on to simple random sampling, there are two names for two other terms to describe the simple random sampling. It's also known as pure random sampling and unrestricted sampling. So for this, every member of the population has an equal chance of being selected. So to conduct this research, you can use some random generator or some kind of calculator, or you can just what do you call this? Get a percentage to take from your population, so you can get your sample. So the population has no differentiated levels or section. It should be the same quality, and you have to include in your report that the percentage of the population in the selected sample. Like I mentioned before, you can use a percentage to take a sample on your population. So the simple random sampling can be quite difficult when you have a very large population. So here's an example that I wrote or I just got from Scribber at least. You want to select a random sample of 100 employees of company X. You assign a number to every employee in the database from 1 to 1000. So 1 to 1000 is our welcome. So 1000 is our population and you want to get 100 employees for our sample. So and you use a random generator to select 100 numbers. So you can, as I said earlier, you can either use a tool to get those 100 members from your 1000 population, or you can just use of some kind of percentage or technique to get those sampling members. So moving on to systematic sampling. So it's a bit similar to simple random sampling, but it's usually slightly easier to conduct. So every member of the population is listed with a number, but instead of randomly generating numbers or randomly selecting them, unlike simple random sampling, individuals are chosen at regular intervals, and those regular intervals are like patterns. So make sure that there is no hidden patterns in the list that might skew the sample. So to explain more the patterns, or let me just give an example. So let's say you want to get some sampling, yes, again, then you will choose the listed members by the multiples of three. So the person who is 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, etc. will be the one included in your sample. So here's another example. So all employees of the company are listed in alphabetical order from the first 10 numbers. You randomly select a starting point, number 6, from number 6 onward, for every third person on the list is selected. So what this means is basically here it says from 6, 16, 26, 36. So every number that includes 6, you will be in your what do you call this, in the numbering in the listing, will end up in your sample, and you end up with sample of 100 people. Okay, moving on to stratified sampling. So stratified sampling involves dividing the population into subpopulations that may differ in important ways. It allows you to draw more precise conclusions by ensuring that every subgroup is properly represented in the sample. So to use this sampling method, you divide the population into subgroups, and those subgroups are called strata based on their relevant characteristics. So they must have the same quality. Okay, sorry. So they must have the same quality, like in simple random sampling. So based on overall proportion of the population, you calculate how many people should be sampled from each subgroup. After that, you use the the first two, which is the first two, which is the random and systematic sampling, to select a sample from each subgroup. So here's an example. So the company has 800 female employees and 200 male employees. You want to ensure that the sample reflects the gender balance of the company. So you sort the population into two stratas or two subgroups based on their gender. Then you use random sampling on each group, selecting 80 women and 20 men, which gives you a representative of 100 people. So moving on to the last one for our probability sampling, which is the cluster sampling. So cluster sampling also involves dividing the population into subgroups like stratified. But unlike stratified, instead of sampling individuals into subgroups with the same quality, you can have those subgroups called clusters. They can have different characteristics from each other. And instead of just selecting from subgroups, selecting individuals in subgroups, you just randomly select the entire subgroup or the entire cluster for dealing with the cluster sampling is for dealing with large dispersed population. That's why you select those whole subgroup. So here's an example. So the company has 10 offices in 10 cities across the country, all with roughly the same number of employees in similar roles. So those 10 offices will now be your cluster. You don't have the capacity to travel to every office to collect your data, so you use random sampling to select 3 offices, and those are your clusters. So there are 3 types of cluster sampling. So there is the first one stage cluster sampling. It randomly selects clusters that are included in the sample. So you just select a cluster and that's it. And for the two-stage cluster sampling, members of the samples are randomly selected from randomly selected clusters. So you randomly select a cluster, then you randomly select members in those randomly selected clusters uh, for your samples. It's a bit redundant, so it's a bit hard to understand. So multi-stage cluster sampling can be further grouped into smaller clusters, and the sample is randomly selected from those smaller clusters. So you take some clusters, then you group them into even more smaller clusters. Then you take your samples from those smaller clusters. So that's pretty much it for probability sampling. So does anyone have any questions? While I wait for your questions, I'll remind again that some, not some, that what will appear in your exams are the definitions, what type of sampling method it is, and which type of sampling method you will use on that problem. So make sure to take note of their definitions, especially uh, sample and population, uh, sample and population, the definition of probability sampling and non-probability sampling, and I guess the other sampling, the definitions of the types of sampling methods in those two, and that's pretty much it. So looks like there's no questions. So we will move on now to non-probability sampling. I will. Oh yeah. So I will send the file here, the PowerPoint I made, to the GC I made, so you can review this since it has some key points. But it's still better to check out the Scriber and the one in Genio. So I will send to the link in Scriber and this PPT. So again, thank you. We will now move on to the non-probability sampling.
So hi, so I'll be teaching the non-probability sampling methods. So in non-probability sample, individuals are selected based on non-random criteria, and not every individual has a chance of being included. So for short, just like what unlike what John Ray said earlier in um, probability probability sampling methods, John Ray said that there is an equal chance of being selected. So while in non-probability sampling methods, so not every individual has a chance of being selected or included in this research. So this non-probability sampling methods is supposed to be easier and cheaper to access, but it has a high risk or percentage that it can be a bias or a sampling bias. So non-probability sampling techniques are usually used in exploratory and qualitative research. So there are four types of non-probability sampling methods. There are convenience sample, purposive sample, snowball sample, and quota sample. So for our number one is convenience sample. So a convenience sample, it includes the individuals who happen to be most accessible to the researcher. And this is also an easy and expensive way to gather initial data. But there is no way to tell if the sample is representative of the population, so it can't produce generalizable results. So for short, in convenience sampling, the easy way to identify if it is a convenience sampling is when it says there that the researcher or the one who is providing the research will be getting a sample near him or her. So for sure that it involves collecting samples or data that is near to the researcher. So our example here is you're researching opinions about student support services in your university. So after each of your classes, you ask your fellow students to complete a survey on the topic. This is a convenient way to gather data, but as you only surveyed students taking the same classes as you at the same level, the sample is not representative of all the students at your university. So another example is you were asked to interview at least 20 people, not interview, but let 20 people answer your survey questions. So you chose a place which is in front of the grocery stores. So you're going to select people near you or closer to you. The number two is voluntary response sampling. So voluntary response sampling is kind of similar to a convenience sample. A voluntary response sampling is mainly based on ease of access. Instead of the researcher choosing participants and directly contacting them, people volunteer themselves. So in short, people volunteer to answer survey questions. So you don't select them, but they will be the one who will give their answers to you, or you will be volunteering that they will answering your survey. So example here is you send out a survey to all students at your university, and a lot of students decide to complete it. This can certainly give you some insight into the topic, but the people who responded are more likely to be those who have strong opinions about the student support services, so you can be sure that their opinions are representative of all students. So another example is, let's say you're a YouTuber and you held a beauty competition, then you ask people to send their responses to you on who they think who should win the beauty competition that he or she held. So number three is purposive sampling. So this type of sampling, also known as judgment sampling. So this involves the researcher using their expertise to select a sample that is most useful to the purposes of the research. So this purposive sampling is usually used in qualitative kind of research. So purposive sampling is usually you choose people. Yeah, you select people based on their expertise. If they are qualified to your research, or they're expert in your research. So that's why it is purposive. So an example here is you want to know more about the opinions and experiences of disabled students at your university. So you purposely select a number of students with different support needs in order to gather a varied range of data on their experiences with student services. So another example is, let's say you were planning to launch a coffee product, and what you did is distribute some samples to expert coffee to the famous or expert tester. So then they will give you feedback for improvement and development. So next is snowball sampling. So this is the last for non-probability sampling methods. So if the population is hard to access, snowball sampling can be used to recruit participants via other participants. The number of people you have access to snowballs as you get in contact with more people. So snowball sampling is getting a participant or a sample through another person by other participant. So let's say the example here is you're researching experiences of homelessness in your city. Since there are no lists of all homeless people in the city, probability sampling isn't possible. You meet one person who agrees to participate in the research, and she puts you in contact with other homeless people that she knows in the area. So another example is you need to interview or question people who are disabled and at the same time homeless in your city. But again, there is no qualified or available participant that is disabled and homeless. So you ask your friend or another person to participate in your research, and let's say she or he agrees. So she will help you to put you in contact with other disabled and homeless people that she knows in your city. So that's for non-probability sampling methods. So we have four: convenience sampling method, um, purposive sample, snowball sample, and quota sample. So do you have any questions? You have no questions? So let me give the if you have no question any further questions, so John Rain will remind something to you.
Okay, so again, I'll remind about the things you have to remember and consider. Reviewing for the exam, so it has to be the definitions, most especially population and sampling, and non-probability and probability. You also have to include types of sampling, what type of sampling it is, and which type of sampling will be used in some certain situation or examples, because that will appear in your exam. So since there are no more questions, again, I will give the PowerPoint that I use in the GC that for our group, and also the link for Scriber. Though I must tell you not to just rely on the PPT I made, because one, it's not complete. It only has information regarding probability sampling, so I didn't put non-probability there because I want you guys to check out Scriber and Genu because it's much more informed than just my PowerPoint presentation, which only has the key points. So again, since there's no more questions, that's pretty much our time. We already surpassed 30 minutes. So since there's none, you may now leave. Thank you.